Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Alva Noë. He's professor and chair of philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the author of many books, and today we're talking about his latest one, The Entanglement, How Art and Philosophy Make Us What We Are. So, Dr. Noë, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So the first question I would like to ask you is, since you are, I guess we could say, mostly a philosopher of mind, what got you interested also in art, and what is art for you, and how do you approach it in the book specifically?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's in a way it's both a personal question about me, but in some ways it really gets us right to the very heart of the book. There's different ways I can answer it. One is that, sort of biographically, my first book was called Action and Perception. And the central theme of Action and Perception was the idea that the best biological way to think about perceptual consciousness is as something that the animal accomplishes or achieves, and that it does so against the background of its situation in the environment. For humans, that also means the cultural environment. So this sort of idea, which is sometimes called the enactive approach to perception, places great emphasis on the animal's embodiment and the animal's skills, or the person's embodiment and the person's skills. Perception isn't something that happens inside of us, it's something we do. And to my great surprise, I received a lot of responses to the book from people working in the arts, especially people working in the performing arts, dancers, choreographers, but not only dancers and choreographers, also painters and sculptors and other kinds of artists. And they all were sort of interested as a community. They were interested in seeing what my approach to perception offered them, how it supported their understanding of their own work. But I immediately became interested in these conversations with the question, well, what do they have to teach me about the phenomenon that interests me? What are they doing anyway? What is this work of artists? Are they just making decorations? Are they making pretty things? What are they doing? Especially since they take themselves very seriously, and we take the arts very seriously. So this got me interested in the question: what is art, and what is the source of its value? And my first attempt to explore that was in my book Strange Tools, which was published at the very end of 2015. Strange Tools, subtitle Art and Human Nature. And in that book, I really asked the question: what is art? Why does it matter to us? And what does the fact that it matters to us tell us about ourselves? Mm-hmm. The current book, The Entanglement, goes way beyond Strange Tools, and it's been kind of a transformative experience for me writing it. But to come back to your question, you can think about the question, what is art, kind of anthropologically, or if you like, philosophically. And the contrast I have in mind there is, in one sense, we all know what art is. We can just refer to it. There's painting, and there's music, and there's film, and there's dance, and there's pottery, and there's installation art, and I'm forgetting one, I'm sure. But art is this specific set of making activities that preoccupy human beings pretty much everywhere and pretty much always. So there's probably, if you think of art in terms of those collections of things that we do, playing the drums, playing the flute, writing novels, with all of that is art, there's probably not any straightforward way defining what art is. It's just simply, it's all of that. And so that's what I mean by an anthropological approach. You just kind of, we all kind of know roughly what we're talking about when we're talking about the arts. Can you go deeper? Can you say something more profound about what art is, why it matters to us? And I think you can. I'll tell you my bottom line, but in a way, how you get to the bottom line is the more interesting question. I think that art is the arts are practices, and they're practices through which we reorganize ourselves, and even I would go so far as to say liberate ourselves from the habits and other systems of organization, cultural, biological, emotional, linguistic, that in some sense hold us captive.
Yeah.
And I mean, I could say one more thing about that. The thing is, one of the beautiful things about art and what makes art puzzling is that on the face of it, materially speaking, it really looks no different from other forms of technological manufacture and making. People make things. Somebody manufactured this glass of water, the pen, the computer, the telephone, the systems that we're using right now, the clothes that we're wearing, all of this is made. And art is just more stuff that we make. So one of the interesting questions is, how does the making, the dedication to making in the sphere of art differ from the dedication to making in the sphere of manufacture or industry or technology? And answering that question is the key.
So you mentioned many different things there, and we'll certainly get through them in our conversation. But the question I have now is, then art is much more than, at least in your perception, much more than just a cultural curiosity, as many people would probably think of it, right?
Right. I guess there would be a view according to which, there's the really important things in life, food and security and shelter. And only once a society gets to a certain stage of security and wealth do you have time for art. Art is this kind of, it's an extra. It comes after, and you can do without it. The view that I try to develop in this book, the argument I make, is that there is nothing which is recognizably a human form of life that doesn't have art. And that's because art is in some ways, I want to say it's both a response to the human condition and a precondition of the human condition. We make art to cope with the challenges of our own existence, but art then changes the character of our own existence. And this, by the way, a phrase that I use throughout the book is I speak of the entanglement of life and art. And in a way, this is the kind of the core thought there. Art starts from life. By that, I don't mean that art is about life in a kind of semantic sense. Some art is. I make a picture of you, and then it's about you, and it's about something I experience in my living world. But I mean something more like we make art out of life, or life gives art its raw materials. But the very act of bringing those raw materials into focus in the way that art lets us do gives us resources. I'm speaking very abstractly now. I can give examples later, but gives us resources for living differently, so that we make art out of life, but then life becomes something new in an art world, and then art becomes something new given the changing life, and you get a kind of historical circular pattern of making and remaking and making and remaking, where we face a kind of almost paradoxical conclusion, which is that we are somehow by nature bound up with art, but by that very fact alone, it's no longer quite appropriate to speak of our nature at all, because our nature is changing. And there's even a sense in which, a rigorous, meaningful sense in which we are ourselves artworks.
So could you give us perhaps some examples of how that entanglement between life and art plays out?
Yeah. I'll give you two. I discuss a number of different examples in the book, but I'll give you two right now. One is a kind of fairly straightforward one. Take dancing. It's tempting to think of dancing as a sort of a natural human capacity, or at least it seems to be universal in human societies. And if you think about dancing, it serves all sorts of psychological / anthropological functions. People dance at weddings or at funerals, or they dance in clubs. And when they dance at clubs, it's partly social, and it's about communication, and maybe about courtship, or about, romance. Or it can dance can be many, many different things, but it's always something. Dancing is always bound up with needs. Dancing is also very interesting because it's when people dance, whether in a club or at a party, they feel they get caught up in the dancing. The dancing has a kind of bodily entrainment to it. You don't dance in a deliberate, controlled way. If you dance well at all, you let the dance just happen, and you just move. You let the demands of the situation, the partner, the music, they govern you. So dance is a very interesting, a cognitively extremely interesting thing that people do. But now, what about the art of dancing? What about choreography, the kind of thing that happens on the stage?
Right.
Well, choreography is, I would say, it's dancing severed from the way in which it's ordinarily embedded in our lives. The dancers on the stage are not wooing, they're not courting, they're not, well, what they're doing is an interesting question. But one of the things that I would say about what they're doing is that they're displaying dancing itself. There's this thing we do, it's called dancing, and then the art dancers are putting that thing we do itself on the stage and saying, this is dancing. And so in effect, they're putting us on the stage as people who are habitually culturally organized by dancing. So I see a difference between dance, sometimes I say dance with a capital D, and dancing. Dancing is embedded in our culture and our psychology and our economy of living. Dance is this kind of representation of this thing that we do when we're dancing. But the image that dancing gives us, the image that choreography gives us, that dance with a capital D gives us of what we do when we're dancing, then becomes a template or a model or even a kind of score for how to dance. So that how we spontaneously dance, you or I, when we're at a party or a celebration or in a nightclub, ends up being influenced by the art of dance. But then the art of dance is concerned with the way in which dancing organizes us and our lives. So the art of dance will then be influenced by the changes in the way we dance. And so you get a kind of a loop of the representation of dancing altering dancing, and dancing giving rise to new pictures or models or templates or scores of what dancing can be. Now, you might think, yes, well, there's the kind of natural phenomenon of dancing at the core, and then there's this kind of cultural play that has happened on top of it. But those are now entangled. They cannot really any longer be disentangled, except in thought. Now, what it is to be a human being who dances is to be a human being whose sense of what it is they're doing has been made available to them through art over long periods of time. So dance and dancing, art and life have become inextricably entangled. And this is something we live, each of us individually in the first person. You know, you watch, I talk in the book about, I imagine a little girl dancing by herself in a room to music. What she's doing is informed by a whole set of ideas and images about what she's doing. This is called dancing. Dancing looks like this. This is not dancing. That's something else. This is how one dances. This is how dancing looks to other people. So that there's an interesting way that the girl might just think, oh, put on the music and dance, no thought at all. But in an interesting way, I think, she embodies or incorporates a whole art history, which is not ever finished. So that's one example. Now, that's another example. Is it's actually slightly more complicated, but I'll see if I can give a simple version of it, and we can get into complications if we need to. Mm-hmm. But if I show you a photograph of my son, say this is my kid, it's on my Facebook page, or it's on my family photo album. Here, this is my son. My photograph is functioning, I believe, as a tool or instrument for display. It's playing a role in a communication. I'm letting you see something. I'm showing you something. I'm framing a kind of ostension. This is the Edinburgh Castle, you know, or this is what the lounge looks like at the Lisbon airport. Yeah. We use pictures to show, and we use pictures to show for all sorts of reasons. I can go online and buy a coat looking at the pictures of the coat, and I can zoom in or zoom out or choose this color or that color, look at this model or that model. Or every week I get in the mail from my supermarket the latest deals on chicken and broccoli. And there's pictures of chicken, there's pictures of broccoli. Pictures function in a kind of social economy of communication. Now, I think actually there's a very interesting set of questions there about how depiction works, how pictures work. And I have ideas about that. But what I'm interested in now is the fact that when I make an art picture, I'm no longer just playing the game of showing you something. Because the interesting thing about an art picture, and this is analogous to the dancing situation, the interesting thing about an art picture is there is no one right way to see it. There is no one thing it is showing. It doesn't have a caption that exhausts what it is of. It resists being reduced to a function. There is no user manual that tells you what it is or how to use it or how to make sense of it. What the picture does, the art picture, is it takes itself as a picture and extracts it from the cultural communicative background against which pictures normally have a depictive function. Mm-hmm. And thus it throws you, the person looking at this work of art, back on yourself to interrogate yourself about the role that ordinary non-art pictures have in your life. how pictures shape what we think it is to look at something, or how pictures shape what it is we think to show something, or how pictures affect our feelings about other people, or how we use pictures in different ways than we use in-person viewing. So all of a sudden, this work of art has the capacity to put seeing and being seen and looking and showing and the role these play, the meaning these have in our lives, themselves on display. Just as the choreographer puts dancing on display, the picture puts all the different things that pictures can mean for us, or the things that are depicted can mean for us. Like how I feel about the one depicted, my daughter or God. How do we process what we see? And the work of art then gives us an opportunity. The picture gives us an opportunity, if you like, to uncover the place of pictures in our lives. And that then in turn, I believe, changes what we take for granted about pictures in our lives and lets us have different and new attitudes, not just to pictures, but also to seeing or to showing or to communicating with pictures. And thus you get an entanglement of the art of pictures and our lives with pictures. And when you remind yourself that we've been making and using pictures to show since prehistoric times, the claim I would make is that our very conceptions, I don't say concept, our very conceptions of what seeing is and visual life is, have been made and remade through picture making practices, and in particular, art making practices with pictures over and over and over and over again. It's another example. So then, and this starts to get very exciting for a philosopher, because now you come along and you're a cognitive scientist and you want to study vision, and you think that there is this fixed, stable thing called seeing. Mm-hmm. But do we actually know what seeing is independently of that generative work of re-understanding what we're doing when we see, that is shaped in part by pictoriality?
And so, given what you just said there, how does that all tie to questions surrounding human nature? First of all, I guess, what is human nature? Because many times when we use that term, people are referring to something like some sort of innate psychology that we are born with, something that is unchangeable, something that is sometimes probably the result of our evolutionary history. But in this particular case, by adding art, and then later on we'll also get into philosophy, what kind of picture do we get about how we should understand human nature?
This is the hardest question, because it's not that I really want to deny human nature. Mm-hmm. It's that I want us to recognize the already problematic nature of human nature. And in particular, I want to say that human nature is an aesthetic problem. And let me see if I can explain that.
Okay.
I mean, actually, first of all, as a preliminary for your audience, I should say, and this I think is not an original idea to me, and is not even all that controversial anymore. I think we all recognize how human life is scaffolded by culture and technology. We can do things, you and I, not because we're so smart, but because we are members of a community that gives us the instruments to do it. So we don't catch our own food. We don't make our own clothing. We don't solve our own survival problems. We rest on a an existing network of knowledge and technology that lets us be the way we live. And this, this goes down to very profound levels. We use writing and language to think with. So our very cognitive powers are extended, as the image goes, through technology. So in some sense, we already know that human nature is the stuff of change and evolution, because all of this is evolving and changing. In fact, if you think of the leading sort of accounts of human evolutionary origins, what seems clear is that most of the primary mutations responsible for modern Homo sapien were done a few 100,000 years ago, at least. So all the stuff that we've made since then, language, dress, culture, communication, all of that can't be explained just with reference to the mutations. That's stuff that has been done through collectives of this particular ape that we are over time. So already we're at a step of removal from a certain kind of naive biological reductionism on any, I think, persuasive conception of the human mind and the human life. What I believe is further the case is that human beings resist the ways they find themselves organized by habit, organized by technology. See, technology, we speak of technology, but what is a technology? A tool is just the physical component of a suite of abilities, skills, practices, techniques, habits. So if I can write with a pen, if I can type on a keyboard, I have been shaped, I've been molded, I have been controlled by the keyboard. Sorry, you can see it. Or the pen. The pen was designed for my hand, and my hand learns to be a different kind of thing with the pen. I think that art and philosophy, we'll come to philosophy, you said, are ways that we put ourselves on display for ourselves and let us make changes, let us resist forms of habitual organization. So that's the work of art, that's the work of philosophy, and that's resistance to technology, that's resistance to culture in a way. It's paradoxical because we think of art as culture, but in a way I'm saying art is anti-culture. Art says no to what culture defines us as. Culture says this is how you walk, this is how you talk, this is how you look, this is how you feel. And art says no. Art gives us different ways of walking, talking, looking, thinking, feeling, which then in turn changes us. So does this mean there's no such thing as a science of human life? No. But it means that there's a place inside life for the aesthetic. And I think it has historically been extremely difficult. And maybe even it's finally impossible, I'm not sure, but extremely difficult for science, for what we call experimental or empirical science, to comprehend the aesthetic and its ineliminable place in our lives. Now, let me say why I say that. I actually already gave this example. Take the question of perceptual consciousness. So scientists say, okay, consciousness, it happens in the brain. We can explore its neural correlates. We can use brain imaging and different theories of the brain and different theories of cognitive psychology to model what goes on in the brain when you see.
Right.
But that takes for granted that we know what seeing is. And I submit that there are no final, settled, unproblematic ways of answering the question, what do you see? Now, scientists, for experimental purposes, may choose to operationalize the notion of seeing this way or that way, and that's fine. But you and I, the subjects of seeing, always realize that there's more that we're not saying, is that we're leaving something out. So right now, I see the screen, but I also see the background. Now, do I see all the detail in the background, or do I see some of the detail in the background? Do I only see what I care about? But also my experience right now, it's guided by interest, concern, what we're doing. It's not separate from our communication. It's also not separate from emotions that I have, or curiosities that I have, or a desire to promote my book, or a desire to explain these ideas, or a desire to come across in a good way. I mean, there's this very, very complicated set of relationships I have to my circumstances that I would describe by saying, I see your image on the screen, but I see your image on the screen as a kind of cliche or minimal under description of what I see. And my claim is that our relationship to our own experience is a little bit like our relation to a work of art. There's no one exhaustive way to characterize its meaning. And moreover, the very activity of thinking about our experience, like thinking about a work of art, changes how we experience the work of art and changes how we experience ourselves. And I think that's true for all of the fundamental human categories. It's true for emotion, it's true for perception, it's true for consciousness, it's true for feeling, it's true for affect. I even think it's true for rationality. It's true for reason itself, which means that science rests on this molten, unstable, constantly changing, legitimately contestable domain of the human. And that's an important limitation. It means, I think, that a certain kind of positive knowledge, such as we have in physics or chemistry, is not going to be available to us in psychology or cognitive science.
So, I guess that you've already addressed there at least a little bit the question of, in your view, why probably disciplines like psychology, cognitive science, and other sciences of the mind are not fully equipped to give us a complete understanding of our human experience, human psychology, and so on. But then, could we get that full picture by adding this understanding of art and philosophy that you present in the book? And
Yeah.
if so, what kind of understanding would this be, if not a strictly scientific one?
Right. It's interesting. We assume it's a very funny and bizarre idea that one would think that all knowledge and all experience could be packed into the shape of science. Science is itself a particular mode of human life and inquiry. Mm-hmm. And when you're talking to your kid at dinner, your relation to your child is not the relation you have to an empirical phenomenon. You're in a relationship with your child, and your concerns as a parent, I'm just saying that as an example, I don't know whether you have children, but your concerns as a parent are as much as you care about what's best for your child and what science will tell you what's best for your child, your concerns as a parent are not epistemological in that sense. And so much of human life has nothing to do with what we do when we're in the laboratory. And one of the curious things that philosophy has done is it's opened up this thought that somehow the truest mode of human relationship with the world around us is something like that of the scientist's relation to the scientific object. Maybe this goes back to Descartes. It may go back farther, but in the book I talk about the contrast between Descartes and Vico. For Descartes, the scientific method, the geometrical method, is the basis, is the fundamental mode of knowing. Vico, who I'm not an expert on, and I rely heavily on secondary sources in my understanding of Vico, but Vico is, especially I might say, a lovely book about him by Jürgen Trabant. Vico is a person who thinks of poetry and wit and style and irony as the basic modality of human knowing. And that there's a kind of comprehension, a kind of deep, intellectually rigorous comprehension that has to do with language, words, with the play of the intellect, not the deduction, but the flirtation. It's real. I don't know if he would have said that actually, but not the deduction, but the ironic play of storytelling. And it's interesting because obviously we need both. We need both. Both complement each other. But so the idea that there's no place for the kind of special work we do when we do science is a form of irrationalism. But the idea that all human knowledge should take that form is, I think, an equally benighted form of misunderstanding. And it's one which, interestingly, it strikes me that it's one that we're confronting in a very interesting way in the intellectual space surrounding artificial intelligence, which is its whole separate topic we can put to one side. But so one last thing then I'll shut up because I do give too long answers. I apologize. But I think another name for that space or method of inquiry, which is necessary and complementary to natural science, is philosophy and art. So I think that there's a way in which what philosophy and art aim at doing is not taking questions for granted and looking for the solutions, but they explore the questions we've neglected, or they, a quote that I give in the book comes from the American writer James Baldwin, is that art uncovers the questions that have been hidden by the answers. So, and I think something like that is true of philosophy as well. It's not the answers, it's what the answers hide from view. And one of the interesting things about a work of art, and this is this is a really important piece of phenomenological data. One of the really interesting things about a work of art is it's there for you on display. It's nothing is hidden, as Wittgenstein might have said. It's just, it hangs there, it sits there. And yet, you cannot really see it. It defies straightforward seeing. It makes you do something in order to see it. So for me, and this is, I haven't had a chance to say this yet in our conversation, but it's crucial. I think you appreciate this based on your reading of the book, but I offer a new definition of the aesthetic in this book, or not a new definition. I offer a way of thinking about the aesthetic, which I think is somewhat novel. And for me, the aesthetic denotes the work we do of trying to see what we cannot see, or of trying to bring into focus what is open to view but somehow cut off from us. Aesthetics names the movement from not perceiving to perceiving, or not seeing to seeing, or perceiving or seeing to seeing or perceiving differently. And that's the work that Plato did, and that's the work that Kant did, and that's the work that Hegel did, and that's the work that Wittgenstein did, and that's the work that Frege did, and that's the work that all great philosophers really aim at. Not new data, not new facts, but new ways of seeing what was there all along. Or, which is just to say, works of art or philosophical work invites you to make changes to yourself so that you can come into a relationship with what is there all along. And my view is that you can't eliminate that. I mean, you can close down every art department and every philosophy department and only fund engineering and physics departments, but you can't get rid of art and philosophy, because art and philosophy are prior to physics. Physics is seeking the explanation. Art and philosophy are about perception. They're about a more immediate kind of knowledge. Yeah.
So let me ask you one question about philosophy, just to clarify this point, because it's actually something that, I mean, I'm not sure what is your precise idea here, but when you use the word philosophy, when you talk about philosophy here in our conversation and also in your book, are you referring to what philosophers, academic philosophers, or any other
Yeah.
sort of professional
Yeah.
philosophers do, or is it a broader activity
Yeah.
that people who are
Right.
not professionally philosophers can also do and can also experience through, I don't know, thought processes of reflection about their own condition, about whatever kinds of questions might they
Yeah.
might raise about existence or anything else around them,
Yeah.
let's
Yeah.
say.
Beautiful, beautiful question. Exactly goes right to the very heart of the issue. Um, it reminds me of where our conversation began with my
Mhm.
distinguishing a anthropological sense of what art is from a more philosophical sense. And I think exactly the same point can be made about philosophy. You can think of philosophy as whatever it is that is taught in philosophy departments, so whatever it is that is published by books that are categorized as philosophy books.
Yeah.
And in that sense, and that does kind of give you a nice way of picking out what it is. And if you're a person out there in the world who's never had the privilege of studying philosophy, that's a useful way of thinking about what philosophy is. This is your opportunity you go to a university and you meet people who are dedicated to this work. And that's a very valuable thing. But I would say two things. First, that there's an additional, further sense in which philosophy is a certain style of intellectual work. And that although academic philosophers do that work is not confined to the work of professional philosophers. And I would say that philosophy philosophical problems presents itself potentially, at least, in every walk of life and in every domain. So to make I think a fairly uncontroversial point, there's philosophy done by people who are empirical scientists. Many people believe, and I would agree, that some of Einstein's most important breakthroughs were philosophical, in the sense that he wasn't discovering a piece of information about simultaneity. He was really asking us to get to the heart of what we think we mean when we speak of two events as being simultaneous. Right. He was doing a kind of conceptual analysis, which for me, and I have a kind of Platonic view of this, is a kind of reminding ourselves of how our concepts work and of how our concepts relate to each other. So similarly, I think a lot of the work that counts as cognitive science, whether you think of work by linguists like Noam Chomsky, or work by vision scientists like David Marr or James Gibson, has aspects that are just straight philosophy. You see this in mathematics. I think a lot of mathematics, or like take Frege's anxieties about what numbers were. Those were philosophical anxieties about the ontology of number. So I say all this just because philosophical problems aren't the private property of card-carrying academic professors of philosophy. You can be a mathematician or a neuroscientist or a linguist or a computer scientist and engage with philosophy. So, moreover, I think we engage in philosophy all the time when we, outside of intellectual life altogether, when we interrogate our lives and our values and our choices. Ethics is not confined to the academy. Ethical problems are real problems, and they're philosophical problems. So what's the definition of a philosophical problem then for me? I mean, I don't have a perfect answer, but it's going to be something like this. Philosophical questions are questions that are substantial and significant, but for which there are no decision procedures, or there are no settled ways of answering them. So, I think a classical example is an ethical kind of, where people have different ethical views. There's a real disagreement and it matters, but there isn't a method for deciding. And that's what I would say is, so there is a method for engaging intellectual exchange and argument, but there's no method for deciding in the way that there is inside well-developed empirical theory. Now, the way I just defined philosophical problem is precisely the way Kant's defined an aesthetic problem. The thing about aesthetics is different people can have different aesthetic responses, and there's no way of deciding in advance, as it were, who's right and who's wrong. And yet, according to Kant, the disagreement is intersubjectively significant, actual disagreement. It's not like, I like vanilla, you like chocolate. It's like, no, chocolate is better than vanilla. And we can argue about this. Um, um, and people do argue about it, and they do change their minds over time, not because there's a QED. So I think it was actually Gilbert Ryle who said, no philosophical argument ends with a QED. Thus it is proved. I agree with that. Now, let me say something else. It's a very interesting question. The way I've just characterized philosophy is how that stands in relation to the actual practice of professional philosophers at universities.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a revisionist analysis, or am I saying that there's how does that go? And I guess I would say something like this. The final value of the work done by philosophers at universities like my own is the way it enables the kind of change and transformation that I'm talking about. Whether or not that's the conscious aim or objective of the philosophers in question, and whether or not they have that particular self-understanding. So, these days, I think, especially in the analytic philosophical world, there's a huge pressure to model philosophy on the model of the sciences. So to give an example that is rarely discussed, but I think is very interesting, is in science, you write abstracts of articles and people can search abstracts. Mm-hmm. And that's very useful because if I want to start working on a certain protein, I want to search and find out who else has worked on that protein and be sure I've read everything that's ever been written about it. And so now we abstract philosophy papers too. If you try to publish a philosophical article, you need to submit an abstract. But a philosophy paper cannot be summed up as a simple finding or abstracted claim because there are none in philosophy. That is, in philosophy, the very meaning of the claim is always what the paper is about. Philosophy literally doesn't have a bottom line. It's always an interrogation. The meaning of the bottom line depends on all the conversation and reasoning that gets you there, which is why we can read Kant without agreeing with Kant. We don't say, oh, he was mistaken, therefore we don't read him, or Plato was mistaken, therefore we don't read him, or Bertrand Russell was mistaken, therefore we don't read him. And there's a way in which the category of mistake is not even relevant. What we're interested in is whether the work they're doing helps us with the problems we have. And that depends on the work we do with the text. And that has nothing to do with the bottom line. I mean, it does have to do with the bottom line, but it has to do with how we reach the bottom line. Are mathematical propositions synthetic a priori? Well, the really interesting question is not whether Kant was right or wrong, but what does that mean? What does it mean to say that it's synthetic a priori? Why would one say that? What is the insight one is trying to capture when you say that? And then you can go further. You say, well, it means we don't use ordinary empirical methods for verifying mathematical statements. Well, that's true. So why aren't they just a priori? Well, and yet they seem to be substantial, not merely logical. They seem to be telling us about something. They seem to have content. Oh, okay, so they're synthetic. And so then you tell a story, but then you can get into the discussions, and maybe that is or it isn't a useful way of summing it up. Most people these days, I think, don't argue for the view that mathematics is synthetic a priori. Why not? Anyway, so one of the ideas I play with in the book, which is kind of a whimsical idea, but I think there's really some truth to it, is I think of a philosophical text as like a musical score. And when I teach my students a philosophical text, I'm teaching them not to know what the author believed, but I'm teaching them to play the score, to play alone, to play with, to make philosophy with these resources. And finally the students are going to tell me whether it's meaningful to them. And they either will or will not keep playing. Philosophers grow out of fashion. When I was a student starting my graduate studies, you couldn't have a philosophical conversation about anything without talking about Donald Davidson or Quine. I don't often hear people refer to Quine and Davidson these days. Not because their work is any less important as it once was, but people are less interested in playing it. They want to play other music now. They want to play other styles of thinking now. I might not be correct about that, but I'm giving that as an example. Mm-hmm. Kant has stayed in fashion ever since he appeared. Hegel, Nietzsche, these guys, they're like always popular. Why? Because they're right. And what we talk about, the difference between analytic and continental philosophy, that's to anybody who's outside of philosophy, that's the stupidest thing that there could possibly be. Like, or for that matter, Western philosophy versus world philosophy. Why should we only care about philosophy in one language or in one tradition? That's silly. On the other hand, if you think of it as like music, well, people live inside their musical cultures. They live inside their artistic cultures. I don't know how to speak Chinese, and I don't know how to play Chinese philosophy. I mean, I don't mean to be making an argument for like ignorance, but on the other hand, people specialize. People live inside the places where they find themselves. And in doing so, they also expand. So European philosophy is not confined to Europe.
So let me ask you one question. I think that you've already been touching on this throughout our conversation, but when it comes to science specifically, taking into account the sort of a framework that you present in the book, and since science itself is also, of course, a human endeavor, then how does it relate to philosophy, to art, and is there space for art, for example, in the very practice of science, or not?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm thinking about it because it's, I really don't want to say no to science. I want to say yes to art and yes to philosophy. And I think that, in the book, the way I explore this is I want to differentiate art from life, or art from technology. And I want to which means like I differentiate art from design. And I differentiate philosophy from science. But these are entangled.
Right.
There is no science without philosophy, and there is no philosophy without science. Not just because some philosophers are sometimes interested in empirical questions, or some scientists are sometimes interested in philosophical questions. but because science and philosophy are different neighborhoods or sort of different ends of a spectrum, to change the metaphor. And there's also neighborhoods where they're very near to each other. So some philosophical work just is not interestingly or meaningfully different from empirical scientific work, and vice versa. So notice I'm not saying, oh yeah, scientists should study art because it'll be a useful method for their scientific work.
Mm-hmm.
That may or may not sometimes be true. I mean, a very interesting domain kind of problem that comes up in science is visualization. Whether a scientist is trying to visualize a black hole with a picture, or visualize, or in some sense represent the structure of a protein molecule, or whether they want to represent how the brain is built. I mean, an interesting example is Golgi and Cajal won the Nobel Prize essentially for making good pictures of cells. They just took pictures of cells. They figured out how to do it, but they didn't just photograph the cell. Ramon y Cajal drew the cell, and his drawings were theoretically informed explanations of how the cells worked.
Mm-hmm.
So he really understood the dendritic and the axonic structure and the cell body versus these fingerings that come out. So in a way, all he did was help you see something that was there, which is very close to my definition of what an artistic project is. And he certainly, apparently, from what I understand about Ramon y Cajal, Santiago Ramon y Cajal's life, is that he wanted to be an artist, and his father said no. His father said, you have to stay in the family business, which was medicine. So he found a way to be an artist in medicine. And these drawings of his, I'm sure you've seen them.
Mm-hmm.
There's now some beautiful books available, the reproduction. These are puzzling drawings. Now, I mean, they're interesting drawings. Now, for me, I said at the outset that the difference between an art drawing and a mere pictorial drawing is that a mere pictorial drawing has a function. It's of something. And you read the caption and that tells you what it's of. And this is a representation of that. So if you stick strictly to that definition, then Ramon y Cajal's work is not artwork, it's illustration. But is it only that? Is it ever only one thing? Are things ever only one thing? This is a really interesting point because this is a feature of the entanglement. So take the great paintings of Renaissance churches. In a sense, they have a caption. These are illustrations of stories from the Bible for illiterate people. These are precisely didactic, functional tools for indoctrination. But they're not only that. They're never only that. I mean, sometimes they are only that, and then they're not very artistically interesting. But the reason why even non-Christian people, non-religious people visit those churches today is because they're not only that.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be true of Cajal, Ramon y Cajal as well, which is interesting. So I don't want to be dogmatic. And this is why I use this metaphor of the entanglement, because it allows you to see how two things can become one thing even though there are two things.
So I have one last topic that I would like to explore with you here today. I'm not sure if this will be necessarily my last question or not, but let's see. So even before we started recording, we were talking a little bit, and one of the subjects that we touched on that I thought would be very interesting to bring back here to the interview was that across the world at the moment, at least, and you were talking about there in the US, and I said that here in Portugal is more or less the same. People are feeling this sense of uneasiness. We think that, or we look at things as very fragile. I mean, the economic situation, the political context,
Yeah,
new wars breaking out, climate change, and so on. Everything seems very unstable. And the reason why I'm bringing this to the conversation is that I mean, is there any way by which we can understand uh, our current state and the way we're reacting to things, our sense of uneasiness and so on, through the kind of framework that you
yeah,
bring to your book?
yeah. I'm glad you bring this up. It's something I've been thinking a lot about. One of my favorite texts in this vicinity is Husserl's the Crisis of the European Sciences.
Mm.
I don't know if this is a book that you know. It was published it was written in the late 1930s after Husserl was already in exile. He was forced into exile, lost his professorship because he was Jewish, and under National Socialism he couldn't teach. He was in Prague, I think, when he wrote this book, and the Second World War was on the horizon, confronting Germany, Europe, and the world. And in that book, Husserl makes, by my reading at least, a wild claim. He says that the problem that the world is facing is a philosophical problem. Here's Germany getting ready to invade all of Europe. He himself has been deprived of his position. Anti-Semitism is run amok. And the problem is philosophical. And specifically, he thought it was a problem with European science, a philosophical problem about science. And then further, what the problem was for Husserl was not that science was too insufficient or too weak, but that it was too strong, that it was too powerful, it was too effective. Science was taking over everything, and every space seemed to be a scientific space. But Husserl said that the kinds of standards of precision, positivity that science offers us don't apply to ourselves. Just as I've been arguing, they don't apply to consciousness, subjectivity. They don't apply to reason itself. Now, how you get from there to the Second World War that's a kind of I'm not sure that's the direction I want to go in. But our cultural moment strikes me as very, very similar to his. Science is immensely prestigious in our world today. And yet, the fundamental picture of human life that science offers is very limited. I mean, there are different there are different offerings. There's the evolutionary perspective, according to which we're genes. There's the sort of the neuroscientific perspective, according to which we're just brain cells. There's the kind of computational perspective, according to which we're just algorithms. But I think that there's something dissatisfying and unbelievable that the embodied, socially situated, historical beings that we are could be just brain cells or just genes or just algorithms. And that then in turn, I think, maybe breeds anti-scientific suspicion, because there's a kind of way in which science is making claims that are not believable. So, and maybe that feeds crisis. I'm not sure. Certainly one of the different crises we face, when you think about the climate crisis, is how many people deny the climate crisis. We saw during the pandemic how many people denied the necessity and efficacy of vaccine. Religious fundamentalists around the world, deny evolution. They deny science, and in one sense, don't get me wrong, I speak as a lover of science. In one sense, I think they are rightly castigated as ignorant and idiotic, these people who attack science in that way, but not entirely, because science, as Husserl feared, knows no bounds and seems to be the only game in town. But these important questions that matter to us about values, subjectivity, consciousness, rationality, these questions are not science's questions. But how do we answer them? Well, they're philosophy's questions, they're art's questions. So again, I would be embarrassed to argue that art and philosophy can save us. that we can, that art and philosophy are going to cure the climate crisis. No, obviously not. You need science for that. But science alone can't do it either. Art and philosophy are part of the solution. And so in one way, you can think of my book, it has many, I'm doing different things in the book, but one of the things I'm doing is I'm making an argument against the STEM worldview, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, as if that's the important thing. And I appreciate that not everybody can be a philosopher, not everybody can be an artist, just as not everybody can be a scientist or an engineer. But it does seem to me that if we neglect science and art, our situation is very hopeless. Excuse me, if we neglect philosophy and art, our situation is very hopeless.
So, yeah, so perhaps that would be a good note to end on. The book is again The Entanglement. Sorry?
A very sad and depressing note, I suppose, but in a way, I mean it to be a positive note.
Mm-hmm.
I'm singing the praises of art and philosophy.
Yes. So the book is again The Entanglement, How Art and Philosophy Make Us What We Are. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Noë, just before we go, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Oh yeah, thank you. I have I teach at the University of California in Berkeley, and you can Google me and find my website there. I actually have a private website as well, alvanoe.com. So it's my www.alvanoe.com. I'm on what used to be called Twitter at Alva Noë. And in addition to my post at Berkeley, I'm currently an Einstein visiting fellow at the Free University in Berlin. So I spend a chunk of time running an art and philosophy project there. And so I can also be contacted through the Free University. And for those of you in Germany or in Europe.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Noé, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. I really loved the book, so I can't recommend it enough to my audience, and I hope that everyone out there that will eventually listen to or watch this interview will buy the book. So, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, and it's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's been a pleasure for me too, and thank you to your audience.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanous, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.